It was just past midnight on March 8, 2014. Kuala Lumpur International Airport was humming with the usual late-night rhythm of departures. Gate C5 was busy. Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370, a Boeing 777-200ER, one of the most advanced, reliable commercial aircraft ever built, was loaded with 227 passengers and 12 crew members, bound for Beijing Capital International Airport, a routine red-eye flight, the kind that happens hundreds of times a day across the world. The passengers were ordinary people. Chinese artists were traveling home, Malaysian engineers, a family of 4, 2 parents, 2 kids, on their way to visit relatives. There were 6 Australians, 7 Indonesians, and 3 Americans. 153 of the 227 passengers were Chinese nationals. There was also a group of 20 employees from a Texas-based semiconductor company, Freescale Semiconductor, which later fueled its own conspiracy theory. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, 53, had been with Malaysia Airlines for 33 years. He was experienced and respected, with over 18,000 flight hours to his name. His co-pilot, First Officer Fariq Abdul Hamid, 27, was relatively newer, but considered competent. He was just weeks away from completing his certification on the 777 at 12:41 a.m. local time. MH370 pushed back from the gate and taxied into the dark. At 12:42 a.m., it received clearance for takeoff. The aircraft climbed smoothly into the night sky, heading northeast toward Vietnam and eventually China. Everything looked completely normal. At 1:01 a.m., Fariq checked in with air traffic control, reporting the aircraft at cruising altitude, 35,000 feet, standard, routine. At 1:19 a.m., as MH370 was about to transition from Malaysian airspace into Vietnamese airspace over the South China Sea, the final radio call came through. Fariq signed off with the words, "Good night, Malaysian 370, calm, relaxed, completely unremarkable." And then silence. MH370 never checked in with Ho Chi Minh City Air Traffic Control as it was supposed to. Vietnamese controllers tried to raise the plane. Nothing. They contacted Kuala Lumpur. Kuala Lumpur tried too. Nothing. At 1:21 a.m., just 2 minutes after that final radio call, the aircraft's transponder, the device that broadcasts the plane's identity, altitude, and position to air traffic control radar, simply stopped transmitting. MH370 had vanished from civilian radar. In the history of modern commercial aviation, this had essentially never happened before. A Boeing 777, one of the most sophisticated aircraft on the planet, with 239 people aboard, had disappeared. Not crashed with debris and emergency signals, not diverted with explanations, just disappeared. When the plane failed to arrive in Beijing, China and Malaysia scrambled to respond. Search and rescue operations were launched in the South China Sea, based on the last known position of the aircraft. Ships, planes, and helicopters from Malaysia, Vietnam, and China all converged on the water. The world's media descended on the story. Families of passengers rushed to airports in Beijing and Kuala Lumpur, desperate for information. Malaysia Airlines set up a crisis center. The initial assumption was that the aircraft had gone down somewhere over the South China Sea, and that wreckage would be found quickly. But there was no wreckage, no debris, no oil slick, no emergency locator signal, nothing. And then things got stranger. Malaysian military radar data, which had not been immediately shared with civilian authorities or the public, told a completely different story. The military had actually been tracking an unidentified aircraft, later confirmed to be MH370, that had turned sharply west at 1:21 a.m., just as the transponder went dark. The aircraft had performed a sweeping 180-degree turn over the South China Sea and was flying back over the Malay Peninsula, going in the complete opposite direction from Beijing. This was not a plane in distress that had nosedived into the South China Sea. Whoever or whatever was controlling MH370 had deliberately flown it somewhere. The military radar tracked MH370 until 2:22 a.m. when it reached the Andaman Sea, northwest of Malaysia. After that, even military radar lost the plane. But the story didn't end there. A satellite, an Inmarsat communications satellite in geostationary orbit, had been passively exchanging automated electronic handshake signals with MH370's satellite data unit. These pings as they became known, weren't transmitting location data. They were just technical check-ins between the aircraft's systems and the satellite, but they contained hidden information, specifically the delay in signal travel time and the Doppler frequency shift that could be mathematically processed to determine approximately how far away the aircraft was from the satellite and in which direction it was moving. The last of these pings occurred at 8:19 a.m., more than 7 hours after MH370 disappeared from radar. 7 hours. The plane had been flying somewhere for 7 hours after its last radio transmission. Inmarsat engineers worked around the clock and determined that MH370 had flown south, deep into the southern Indian Ocean. The final ping established what investigators called the seventh arc, a curved band on the surface of the southern Indian Ocean where MH370 must have been when it sent its last automated signal. Somewhere along this arc, in one of the most remote, hostile, deepest stretches of ocean on Earth, MH370 had gone down. The search moved to the southern Indian Ocean. It would become the most expensive aviation search in history. For over a year, the southern Indian Ocean yielded nothing. Then, on July 29, 2015, 515 days after MH370 disappeared, a piece of debris washed ashore on the island of Réunion, a French territory in the Indian Ocean near Madagascar. It was a flaperon, a wing component. Analysis confirmed it was from MH370. It was the first physical evidence that the aircraft had, indeed, gone into the ocean. Over the following years, more debris appeared along the eastern coast of Africa and on islands in the Indian Ocean. Pieces of wingskin panels, parts of the horizontal stabilizer, a section of the interior cabin, and even what appeared to be a piece of luggage. In total, over 30 pieces of suspected MH370 debris have been collected from the shores of Mozambique, Tanzania, South Africa, Mauritius, Madagascar, and Réunion. 3 wing fragments were conclusively confirmed as belonging to MH370, but the main wreckage, the fuselage, the tail section, the flight data recorder, and the cockpit voice recorder have never been found. And without those black boxes, the true story of what happened in the cockpit remains unknown. The official underwater search, managed by the Australian Transport Safety Bureau and costing governments approximately 200 million Australian dollars, covered roughly 120,000 square kilometers of the southern Indian Ocean seabed. It was called off in January 2017. The year after, private company Ocean Infinity resumed the search on a no-find, no-fee basis. Covering another large area, they found nothing. In March 2025, Malaysia reached a new agreement with Ocean Infinity. The company deployed its vessel Armada 7806, equipped with autonomous underwater vehicles, to search a newly identified 15,000 square kilometer high-priority zone along the 7th arc. This time, the search was more targeted, driven by improved drift analysis of the debris, advances in AI-assisted probability mapping, and new oceanographic data. The search ran from late December 2025 into early 2026. On March 8, 2026, the 12th anniversary of the disappearance, the Malaysian government confirmed that this latest search had also failed to locate the aircraft. The plane is still missing. Before we dive into theories, let's examine what the evidence actually tells us, because it is more revealing than most people realize. The 180-degree turn and the switch-off of the transponder were deliberate. A Boeing 777 cannot accidentally reprogram itself to make a precision turn, silence its own transponder, and fly for 7 more hours on a new heading. Something or someone in that cockpit made conscious decisions. The ACARS system, the Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, which sends automated maintenance and operational data, was also disabled or stopped transmitting shortly before the transponder was switched off. These are separate systems that require deliberate, knowledgeable action to disable. This is not the behavior of a plane experiencing mechanical failure. A catastrophic mechanical failure does not selectively disable communication systems before it happens. The satellite ping data from Inmarsat showed the aircraft flying south for approximately 7 hours, deep into the Indian Ocean. This was later analysed by an independent group called the Independent Group, as well as researchers at Australia's CSIRO, and the data strongly supports a southerly flight path. The debris drift analysis has been refined over years. Scientists use the confirmed GPS coordinates of where each piece of debris was found, combined with ocean current models, and back-calculated to estimate where in the southern Indian Ocean the debris originated. Multiple studies converge on a crash zone, generally between 33 and 36 degrees south latitude along the 7th arc, slightly north of where the main search focused in the early years. The most recent Ocean Infinity search targeted this zone specifically. One crucial detail, a partial analysis of the wing flaperon found on Réunion showed that it had not been deployed when the aircraft hit the water. This suggests the plane was not configured for a controlled landing attempt. It may have been in a dive or falling mostly intact when it impacted the ocean. This is the part the internet can't stop arguing about, and it's where things get dark, strange, and deeply human all at once. Because in the absence of an answer, the human mind fills the void. This is the theory that most aviation investigators privately consider most likely, though Malaysian authorities have officially refused to conclusively state it. The argument is this: the actions taken, the deliberate turn, the communication blackout, the long southward flight into an unpopulated ocean, are most consistent with a person who knew exactly what they were doing and intended the aircraft to disappear. Investigators found that Captain Zahari had a simulator at home, as many enthusiastic pilots do. Analysis of the simulator data showed that someone had apparently plotted a route into the southern Indian Ocean and then deleted the files. This was widely reported but later disputed, with analysts disagreeing on whether the data was truly deleted or just routine cached files. The theory gained traction in 2023 when journalist Florence de Changy, after years of investigation, and separately aviation expert Simon Hardy, both analyzed the flight data and argued that the aircraft flew a specific path consistent with a deliberate and meticulous final flight. Zahari was reportedly going through personal difficulties, though no definitive motive has ever been established. His family and colleagues have consistently denied the possibility, and Malaysian officials have stated they found no evidence to support a specific motive. The counter-argument is this: the debris indicates the plane may have entered the water in a high-speed dive, not a controlled ditching. Some analysts argue this is inconsistent with a deliberate act by a skilled pilot, who would have more likely guided the aircraft to a controlled final approach. A competing theory, endorsed by some credible aviation experts, including former Australian transport safety official Larry Vance, suggests a fire or other catastrophic event, possibly related to the cargo hold, which contained lithium-ion batteries, incapacitated the crew and left the aircraft flying on autopilot until it ran out of fuel. In this scenario, the crew might have begun an emergency diversion, turned the aircraft around to return to Kuala Lumpur or divert to Penang, and then been rendered unconscious before they could complete any further communications or emergency procedures. The plane would have flown on autopilot, ghost-like, for hours until fuel exhaustion. This theory has some appeal because it doesn't require anyone to have done anything intentionally wrong. But critics point out that it struggles to explain why both communication systems were disabled before any obvious emergency, and why a distressed crew would reprogram the flight management system to a heading into the middle of nowhere rather than the nearest airport. The fact that 20 employees of Freescale Semiconductor, a company that worked on advanced military electronics, were on board MH370 sparked a wave of conspiracy theories. Some suggested that someone with advanced electronic warfare capabilities had remotely taken control of the aircraft. Boeing 777s are theoretically hackable, some cybersecurity researchers have argued, though Boeing has consistently denied that any such capability exists or could be exploited. This theory has very little credible support in the aviation investigation community, but it has never fully died online because of the sheer coincidence of those passengers' employers. Another theory circulating online, particularly in Malaysia and China, suggests that MH370 was intercepted and shot down by a foreign military, possibly the United States, either by accident or intentionally, and that a cover-up followed. Proponents point to the US military presence in the region and the Diego Garcia military base in the Indian Ocean. They note that the US radar systems in the area should have been able to track MH370, but no relevant information was ever publicly released. There is no confirmed evidence supporting this theory. The debris that has washed ashore is consistent with an ocean impact, not an in-air explosion, though the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Some theorists, using the satellite ping data differently, argued that the aircraft turned north rather than south after its last known position and landed somewhere in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, or Pakistan. This theory was popularized early in the investigation, but was largely discredited when more rigorous analysis of the Inmarsat data confirmed the southward trajectory. The debris washing up on African coastlines has further undermined it. A subset of this theory suggests the plane landed on a remote island in the Indian Ocean. Diego Garcia, the British-American military atoll, features prominently in these theories. Again, no credible evidence supports this. This is the most recent and technically sophisticated theory still being actively investigated. Researcher Richard Godfrey has used a network of amateur radio signals called SPR, Weak Signal Propagation Reporter, to attempt to track MH370's final flight path. Aircraft can interfere with these radio signals as they pass through them, leaving a faint detectable trace. Godfrey and colleagues have mapped what they believe is MH370's path across the Indian Ocean and identified a more specific crash location further south and east than the main search zones. This methodology is scientifically controversial. Critics argue that SPR was not designed for aircraft tracking, and the signal anomalies could have many other causes, but it has attracted serious attention and contributed to the selection of the latest search areas. Behind every data point and theory are 239 human beings, and the families of those people have endured not just the grief of losing someone, but more than a decade of institutional failure, inconsistent information, and official silence. Malaysian authorities were slow to share the military radar data. For days after the WEG disappearance, they allowed the world and the families to believe the aircraft had gone down in the South China Sea, while they privately sat on information showing it had flown in the opposite direction. When they finally revealed the westward turn, it was after days of confusion that wasted search resources and prolonged the anguish of families who were watching television news, trying to figure out if their relatives were dead. The final official safety report, released in 2018, identified air traffic control lapses in both Kuala Lumpur and Ho Chi Minh City that delayed the recognition that something was wrong. It was more than an hour after MH370's transponder went dark before anyone formally declared the aircraft missing. In those minutes and hours, critical decisions about search areas were made based on wrong assumptions. In December 2025, a Beijing court ordered Malaysia Airlines to pay approximately $410,000 to each of 8 families under the Montreal Convention, at least 23. Related cases remain pending in Chinese courts. For the families, justice has been as elusive as the wreckage. Many have spent years not knowing whether to hold a funeral, whether to settle insurance claims, or whether to stop hoping. Some families have never accepted the official conclusion that the aircraft is in the southern Indian Ocean. They have organized, protested, traveled to Malaysia repeatedly, and demanded answers. A group called Voice 370 has been relentless. They have challenged official timelines, questioned the Inmarsat analysis, and pushed for renewed searches year after year. Their grief has never been allowed to conclude. MH370 exposed an extraordinary gap in global aviation surveillance. In 2014, once an aircraft crossed beyond the range of ground-based radar, which covers only about 30% of the Earth's surface, primarily land areas, it could be tracked only through voluntary radio communication and systems like ACARS. In remote oceanic regions, a plane could, essentially, disappear. In the years since, the International Civil Aviation Organization developed new standards. The Global Aeronautical Distress and Safety System and ADS-B satellite tracking now allow aircraft to be tracked globally every 15 minutes in oceanic airspace, and every minute when an aircraft is in distress. Most major airlines have adopted these systems. The era of a commercial aircraft vanishing from all tracking for 7 hours in normal operation is, in theory, over, but the implementation has been uneven. Not all airlines, not all aircraft, not all regions have fully adopted the new standards, and the systems can still be disabled from inside the cockpit. MH370 demonstrated that a determined actor can sever an aircraft's electronic connection to the outside world and the industry has not yet fully solved that problem. 12 years after it vanished, MH370 remains the greatest unsolved mystery in commercial aviation history. The most expensive aviation search in history spent hundreds of millions of dollars and covered over 120,000 square kilometers of ocean floor without finding the main wreckage. The most recent search, conducted between December 2025 and early 2026, covered approximately 7,200 square kilometers before being called off due to weather and operational constraints, less than half of the planned area. Ocean Infinity is expected to continue further phases of its search, pending weather conditions and planning. The Malaysian government has described this as potentially the last realistic opportunity to find the aircraft, given the financial and logistical challenges of searching the most remote and hostile ocean on Earth. 3 wing fragments confirmed as belonging to MH370 are the only physical evidence that this plane exists anywhere on this planet. No black boxes, no fuselage, no personal belongings of the 239 people who were on board. The ocean has given up almost nothing. The most credible scientific consensus places the aircraft somewhere along the 7th arc in the southern Indian Ocean, most likely between 33 and 36 degrees south, in waters several kilometers deep. But even in that relatively constrained search zone, the actual debris field could be tiny, obscured by the terrain of the ocean floor, or just outside the edges of every area searched so far. The pilot's suicide hypothesis remains the most logically consistent explanation for the deliberate actions taken. But without physical evidence from the crash site or the black boxes, it cannot be confirmed. And in the absence of confirmation, every other theory lives on. Here is what we know for certain. On the night of March 8, 2014, a Boeing 777 carrying 239 people departed Kuala Lumpur on what should have been an uneventful flight to Beijing. 40 minutes later, someone turned off its communication systems and flew it in the opposite direction for 7 hours. The aircraft eventually ran out of fuel somewhere over the southern Indian Ocean and went into the water. Debris has confirmed this, but where exactly, how exactly, and above all, why, we do not know. The void that MH370 has left is not just in the southern Indian Ocean. It is in living rooms and family homes across Malaysia, China, Australia, France, and a dozen other countries. It is in the nightmares of parents who never got to bury their child. It is in the silence that someone sets a dinner table for a person who is never coming home. It is in the silence of the sky that swallowed an aircraft whole and 12 years later has still not given it back. MH370 is out there, somewhere in the dark, in the cold, in the crushing depth of the southern Indian Ocean. The ocean knows where. We do not yet. If you like this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel if you are new here. Thank you.